let's talk about heresies. See, heresies are bits of theology that a great theological council has declared to be outside of what Christians should believe. And they usually get named after the person that came up with them. But heresies were a way of the early church of figuring out exactly what we believe and what was kind of inside the tent and what was outside the tent. And if what you believed was declared a heresy, it was declared outside of the tent. One of the earliest and kind of most well-known of these heresies was put together by a man named Pelagius. Now, most heresies come about by well-meaning Christians trying to figure something out and just not quite getting there. And Pelagius and the Pelagian heresy is certainly one of those. The basic idea behind Pelagius is he said, okay, and in some ways maybe reading our scripture this morning, if someone works really hard and puts all of their effort into it, they would be able to not sin. Now he said, not many people will ever do this. Very few people would be up for it. But his basic contention is, again, listen carefully, that if one works really hard and puts all of your own effort into it, you would be able to not sin. And what the theological councils, and led by a guy named Augustine, who comes up a lot in Christian theological history, says is, no, you need God's grace to pull off any of that. You can't do it on your own. I can't do it on my own. Pelagius couldn't do it on his own. Augustine couldn't do it on his own. Pelagius did contend that very few people would have even been able to do his thing. But it was declared a heresy because what it did is it left out our need for God's grace. That we need Christ in order to be able to do any of this. And so it's important to carry that thought in your mind. And we as Methodists walk a fine line, right? John Wesley wants us, we're called Methodists because there's a method to our madness. And John Wesley walks a fine line, but even Wesley will tell you that we can do none of our effort without God first moving in our life, without first experiencing God's grace. And so we find ourselves here in the Sermon on the Mount. And as I talked about in last week's children's sermon, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' big speech in Matthew's gospel. And it's Jesus' big speech about what it is to live as a disciple, what it means to follow him, what it means to be a disciple of God. And it was done where he would have sat down on a mountain, as all Jewish teachers would have, and the people surrounding him would have kind of fanned out around the mountain. You've got some pretty good acoustics going on there. And he would have talked. Something important to note about Matthew's gospel in particular is Matthew gets called the gospel of the church. Matthew is the only gospel that really deals with that term, the church. And Matthew always wants us to know that anytime Jesus is talking about discipleship, he's not just talking to the assembled 12. It's not just about 12 random, mostly dudes in 2,000 years ago. He says the disciples and the crowds. He does that to include each of us. We are also disciples. Jesus is talking not just directly to the 12, but directly to us. And so what's said in the Sermon on the Mount is applicable across time and space. And Jesus is attempting to paint a single coherent picture of the life of a disciple. We often want to chunk up the Beatitudes. I'm a peacemaker. I am meek. I am whatever. No, you're all supposed to be meek. You're all supposed to be peacemakers. You're all supposed to quest for righteousness. It's one picture. And so now we arrive in the verses just after the Beatitudes, again, clarifying and adding detail to that picture. And so we get two different declarations in this. We have the bit about salt and light, and we have the bit about the law and the prophets. The salt thing, I admit, doesn't make sense to 21st century ears because you go and buy salt and it's all that white crystalline stuff and it just works as salt, right? And then when you're done with the salt, it's still salt down at the bottom, right? That's how salt works. That's not how salt worked 2,000 years ago. It was impure. And so over time, the real salt would separate out from the kind of impurities. And so what you would end up at the end was just this little flakes of useless, non-salt tasting stuff in the bottom of your salt. And so what Jesus is trying to explain in an analogy that made total sense 2,000 years ago is you want to be the thing that adds the flavor to the food. You want to be the thing that adds the spice to life. You want to be the thing that makes the kingdom good. You don't want to be the impurities that get left over at the bottom that aren't particularly good to anyone and would get cast away. Our salt just doesn't work like that anymore, but that's what Jesus is trying to say. I think the light to the world hits the same point in an analogy that still works. It may not be a candle that we're using now, although some of us might, and if you live in hurricane country, you need them, but for the most part, we're using electric light. But the analogy of being a light in the darkness, of not wanting to hide our light, but letting it shine into the world, of being a city on a hill, which was something the early Puritans used in founding, part of this country. We get that we are supposed to be the people that shine God's light into the darkness. The theological truth is we're the ones who actually do most of that. One of my favorite theologians, and you're going to hear about him a lot, and I just took over the religious column in the paper, and so this is a preview of my newspaper article that goes out Wednesday. There's this theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he wrote this book, Life Together. And you're going to hear me talk about it a lot because it's one of my favorite books. But the basic premise of Life Together is this, that the number one way that anyone experiences God in the world is on the faces of Christians. Again, I'm going to repeat it and think about it. The number one way anyone experiences God in the world is on the faces of Christians. That's me, that's you, that's the 2 billion people that profess Christ. Each of us are literally the lights in the world. Other miracles happen, right? Unexplained miracles, miracles that happen beyond the bounds of Christian community, beyond the bounds of what Christians can do. Those happen as well. Miraculous healings, visitations from angels, all of those are also ways that God is working in the world. But the number one way that any of us will ever experience God, that anyone in the world will experience God, is on our faces, the faces of Christians. So if God's light is to reach the darkness, we need to go into the darkness. If God's light is to reach, we need to shine. And that's what brings us to the second half of today's scripture, the bit about the law and the prophets. What Jesus was trying to remind folks, and we need reminder of this too, is that it's not like there was the Old Testament and then you can kind of throw it away, and then there was the New Testament and that's great. It's all one story of God's people. There's an intermission in the middle, but it's all one story. It's Act 1 and Act 2 of the same story. And so the law that was handed down by Moses on forward is the law that we are judged under as well. Now, we change it a little bit. I looked it up. My shirt is technically an abomination. I like this shirt, also an abomination. It is the mixture of 2 cloths, which is an abomination. We're going to be all watching a football game this evening, I assume. The touching of a pig's skin, also an abomination for the Lord. And if you want some good bedtime reading, spend a lot of time with Leviticus. And you get a lot of those that are like that. But at the heart of the law is the heart of the thing that we are still held accountable for. Jesus spends a lot of the Sermon on the Mount and the next set of verses in chapter 5 saying this. The law says, don't kill a person. Okay, great, don't kill anybody, but don't even think murderous thoughts. Jesus escalates the law, not take it down a notch. Jesus escalates the requirements of the law and says that we need to be as righteous as the Pharisees. And this is why I opened with Pelagius and talking about heresies and funny words from funny times. We can't do it alone. In fact, if effort was all that was needed, the Pharisees would have been the most saved people that there have ever been. The Pharisees had works righteousness down to a literal science. They had ceremonies for how you prepared the food, and then ceremonies how you cleaned yourself before the food, and then ceremonies and rituals for how you ate the food and who you sat with and who you were not supposed to sit with. And they had laws upon laws upon laws. You think Leviticus makes good bedtime reading, you should read the Midrash, which is like Leviticus except it never ends. If Leviticus is like a 20-something, couple dozen chapter book, the Midrash is a stack of documents that high, all put together by the Pharisees and their successors on the exact minutia on how to live a righteous life. So if it was about putting in an extreme effort, Jesus would have just had to come down, point to the Pharisees and go, those guys, we're good. But that's not the plot of the gospel, right? Instead, Jesus comes down and has to say, A, they're kind of missing the point of the law. They've got into the details. They're so far in the weeds they can't see the forest for the trees. 2, the Son of God is among them, and they fail to recognize that, despite the clear signs from the prophets. Jesus comes to remind us, in part, that we need God to accomplish these things. We need God to be able to be righteous. And we're called to be extremely righteous. But we need God's help to do that. We are called to be a light to the world, to shine God's love into the darkness, to be a city on a hill. And we need God. We need Christ to do that. If you think back to your American history or American lit, you might have encountered a Great Awakening preacher named Jonathan Edwards, not the Carolinian politician with the great hair who ran for vice president, the other Jonathan Edwards in American history. Anyone remember Jonathan Edwards? I'm seeing a few nods. Thank you. It's been much longer for y'all, so I have some confidence that people remember. And Jonathan Edwards is famous for writing a lot of things, but for writing this sermon entitled Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, which when I do my impression, which I'm not going to do because my mic's on, do my impression of a fire and brimstone preacher, sinners in the hand of an angry God, just sound like it's great, like it has a great texture to it. But the analogy he uses, and it's important, and I'm, as you picked up on, I'm no great fire and brimstone preacher, but he's trying to make a similar point in a different way. What he says is your good works, your own efforts, are only like a spider web holding you up above a pit. And without God, you would fall into that pit. Now, we can assume what Jonathan Edwards means by that, but that simple image of our own efforts are wildly insufficient. It is only by turning to God that we are able to do any of it, be righteous, and be a light to the world. And this also goes back to what we talked about last week, this idea of one unified Christian life. Be a light to the world, be righteous. They're linked, they're the same thing. In order to be a light to the world, we must also be righteous. In order to be righteous, we are commanded to be lights to the world. There's no separation between righteousness and shining. They are linked in one coherent image of a disciple. And so my challenge for all of us this morning is simple. Turn to God. Turn to God's righteousness. Turn to God's strength. Turn to God's grace. And let God propel us and turn us into lights to the world, because just beyond their walls is a poor county in central Texas. Just beyond those walls are starving children. Just beyond those walls are people experiencing the dark pain of loss, the suffering of cancer. We looked at it. Half of our prayer list is cancer related. Our community is in deep need of light. The light and love of God. And how we can be those lights with God's help and God's strength is by seeking righteousness in all of its forms, and turning and relying on God's strength and God's call, so that we can shine that light. Not just in here to one another, although that is tremendously important, but that light can shine out into the community, out into the world.